Rain swept across the quiet streets of Portland, Oregon, turning every windshield into a mirror of restless light. Edward Kane, 64. 64 drove slowly past the row of maples near Hillside Avenue, his mind still on the blueprints lying on the passenger seat. He had promised to drop them off at his son-in-law's place, just a quick visit before heading home for dinner. Then he saw it. Parked in front of David Sloan's gate was a silver Lexus, his wife's car, Helen's car, the same one that should have been resting inside their garage 20 minutes away. Edward's pulse faltered. The rain hissed against the hood as he eased the Honda to the curb. For a long moment he just sat there watching the faint silhouette moving beyond the curtains. Something's wrong. He stepped out, closing the door without a sound. The damp air clung to his clothes as he crept closer to the window. Through a narrow slit between the blinds he saw them, Helen lounging on the couch, David standing beside her, a glass in his hand, that smug smile Edward had never trusted. And then he heard her voice. Soft, deliberate, cruel. When the old man finally signs the papers, Helen said, "We'll have everything ready." David chuckled, his voice sharp as glass. "By September he'll be too tired to fight. You'll be free and rich." Edward's breath caught. For a second he couldn't move. 25 years of marriage unraveled in one sentence. His hand shook as he pulled his phone from his pocket, thumb-pressing record. The raindrops streaked down the window like silent tears. If you think you know your family, think again. Subscribe before we continue. The drive home blurred into rain and silence. Edward's wipers kept time with the thudding in his chest, each sweep clearing a momentary view of the city before fog returned to claim it again. The recording on his phone kept glowing in the cup holder, a small red light pulsing like a wound he couldn't stop touching. He didn't press play. Not yet. His knuckles tightened on the steering wheel. 25 years, a lifetime of building, saving, loving. And now one conversation through a half-open window had torn it apart. He drove without direction, letting instinct carry him back toward Portland Heights. The Lexus would be home soon too. Helen always made sure appearances remained perfect. The mansion stood waiting at the top of the hill, the rain turning its white columns gray. Edward parked but didn't get out right away. He sat in the still car, listening to the faint hum of the engine, watching the lights of the city below. Somewhere out there, his daughter Lily was finishing her last therapy session of the day. She had inherited Helen's grace, but none of her deceit. He wondered what she would think if she ever learned the truth. Finally, he killed the engine and stepped out. The sound of rain hitting the driveway filled the space where his heartbeat should have been. Inside, the house smelled faintly of lavender and polished wood, the scent Helen loved. Everything was immaculate, arranged the way she liked it. Cushions, centered magazines squared to the table edge, flowers replaced every third day. Edward walked through the stillness, feeling like an intruder in his own home. On the mantel sat their wedding photo, December 15th, 1995. Helen in ivory silk, him in a rented tuxedo, both smiling as though the world had just opened its doors. He remembered how she'd laughed that night, nervous and radiant, promising that they would build everything together. And they had houses, companies, a family. But somewhere between the mortgage payments and charity dinners, the woman who once whispered dreams into his ear had learned to measure love in dollars. He moved to the kitchen, where the anniversary card still stood beside the fruit bowl. Silver letters shimmered under the soft light. To my wonderful husband, thank you for making all my dreams come true. The handwriting was elegant, the loops of her letters still beautiful. But the words now felt like a script rehearsed too many times. He turned the card face down. In the reflection of the window, he saw a man he barely recognized, lined, tired, but not broken. He pulled out his phone and finally hit play. Helen's laughter spilled into the quiet kitchen. It wasn't cruel or loud. It was effortless. Practiced the sound of someone who had already decided she would win. David's voice followed, legal and certain. By September, he'll be too tired to fight. Edward stopped the playback and stared at the screen. The rain outside blurred the city lights into long ribbons of gold. Somewhere a clock struck 7. Helen would come home soon, pretending nothing had happened. Dinner, small talk, the same routines that once defined peace and now felt like traps. He thought of the years he had spent working 12-hour days to build Kane builders from a single truck and a rented garage. The sacrifices, the birthdays missed, the vacations postponed, the nights spent drafting blueprints, while Helen hosted charity galas in sequined gowns. He had believed they were partners. Now he understood she had been studying him, memorizing the structure of his empire just to take it apart. The memory of their early days came unbidden. Helen sitting cross-legged on the floor of their first apartment sorting receipts while he planned budgets, her head resting against his shoulder when the power went out during a storm, her voice saying, "We'll make it, Ed, you and me against the world." He almost smiled at the memory before it curdled into bitterness. Maybe she meant it then. Maybe not. The truth no longer mattered. What mattered was that she had underestimated him. The sound of tires on wet pavement pulled him back. Headlights swept across the living room walls, the Lexus returning. He slipped the phone into his pocket and straightened his shoulders. The door opened. Helen's heels clicked against the marble, steady and confident. "You're home early," she said, closing her umbrella, eyes flicking over him with the smooth precision of someone gauging risk. "So are you," Edward replied. His tone was calm, almost kind. "I left work early. Headache." She smiled faintly, the same smile she had worn in the photo on the mantel. "You stopped by one of the sites, decided to come back before the rain got worse." They stood in silence for a heartbeat too long. Then Helen turned toward the kitchen. "I'll change and start dinner." He watched her walk away, each step measured graceful false. The house seemed to swallow her. For a moment Edward almost reached out, almost asked, "Why?" But he stopped himself. She would only lie again. Later that night, when she was asleep in the guest room, she claimed was quieter. Edward sat in his office, surrounded by the trophies of a life he had built, framed contracts, architectural sketches, photos of completed buildings. His gaze landed on a framed copy of the company's first major project, the Riverbend Apartments. Underneath, his father's old words echoed in his mind, "Measure twice, cut once." He opened a new notebook, its first page crisp and white. Across the top he wrote, "Helen and David, evidence." He listed the date, the time, and the file name of the recording. Then he drew a single line under it and wrote the words, "Phase 1, observe." The rain outside slowed to a whisper. He leaned back in his chair, letting exhaustion and fury settle into something colder clarity. She thought she was playing chess with a man who didn't know the rules. She forgot who built the board. "They think I'm blind," he murmured into the still air. "Let them believe that." And for the first time that night he almost smiled. The rain had stopped, leaving a fragile quiet hanging over the city. Edward leaned back in his chair, staring at the page where he had written the word, "Observe." The ink had already bled slightly into the paper, dark and permanent, just like what he had heard tonight. He stood and walked to the window. From here, the city looked peaceful, unaware that his life had split down the middle just a few hours earlier. The skyline shimmered through a haze of mist, and the glass reflected his face, a man betrayed, but awake. For the first time in years, his mind felt sharp. The shock had burned away the fatigue, leaving behind something precise. Purpose. Helen's perfume still lingered faintly in the hallway, the scent she had worn since their 10th anniversary gardenia, and something expensive he could never pronounce. Once it had made him smile. Now it made his throat tighten. He wondered how many times that fragrance had followed her into David's house. He returned to the desk and unlocked the top drawer. Inside were decades of habit, meticulous order, perfectly aligned files and ledgers filled with neat handwriting. Numbers had always told him the truth when people wouldn't. He flipped through recent statements, highlighting the ones with Helen's name. Luxury boutiques, high-end restaurants, transfers that didn't match their usual patterns. It wasn't proof yet, but it was a trail. Every betrayal left a signature. Edward's phone buzzed a message from Lily. "Just checking in, Dad. Hope you're staying dry tonight." He stared at the words longer than necessary before replying, "All good, sweetheart. Proud of you." When he set the phone down, his hand lingered on it. He thought of her laugh when she was small, how she used to run to him after school covered in paint and stories. He had built everything for her, for both of them. Now that same love would be what protected her from the storm her mother was creating. He took a long breath, closed the notebook, and straightened the papers on his desk. The fear was gone. In its place stood something colder, steadier, the builder's patience he'd once used to raise towers from bare ground. Brick by brick, plan by plan, he would rebuild his life. But first, he would take apart theirs. He turned off the light. The office sank into darkness except for the faint glow of the city beyond the rain-washed windows. In that half-light, Edward's reflection looked like a stranger who had finally decided to stop forgiving. And in the stillness, he whispered to the empty room, "Tomorrow I begin." Before the storm, there had been laughter. Edward remembered it clearly, the way Helen's voice used to rise above the noise of their tiny apartment, bright and young, as if joy itself had taken human form. They had met in 1994 at a company Christmas party downtown. He was a contractor with dust still under his nails. She was a secretary for a small law firm, dressed in a red sweater and 2 big heels. When he offered to walk her home in the snow, she laughed and said, "Only if you promise not to slip first." Their first months together were all long drives and shared coffee mugs. She loved that he could fix anything, doors, leaky pipes, even broken clocks. "You're building our future one nail at a time," she'd tell him. Back then, every word she spoke felt like a promise carved into stone. When they married, they couldn't afford much. Their wedding reception was held in his cousin's garage, decorated with borrowed lights and plastic tablecloths. Yet to Edward, it had felt like a palace. They built their first home themselves, just 2 bedrooms, a small porch, and a kitchen that always smelled of fresh bread. Helen would hum while painting the walls, hair tied back with an old ribbon, and he would think, "This is happiness." The years passed, and Kane Builders began to grow. One contract turned into 5 into 15. Edward's name started to mean something in Portland. Helen left her job saying she wanted to focus on family. He agreed, why wouldn't he? Her happiness had always been the foundation he worked for, but success changed the rhythm of their lives. The woman who once cared about color palettes and grocery lists began talking about country clubs, charity dinners, and the right kind of friends. She started measuring worth in invitations and compliments. Edward didn't notice the shift at first. He thought it was simply pride. After all, they had earned comfort. They had built it together. Then came 2020, the year everything changed. Edward won the city's biggest contract, a 3-year project that would make headlines. He came home expecting celebration, champagne, laughter. Instead, he found Helen sitting at the kitchen table with a real estate magazine open in front of her. "This means we can finally move," she said. "The Hendersons' house on Laurel Hill is still for sale." He laughed, thinking she was joking. "Helen, we just finished paying off this one." She didn't laugh back. "We've outgrown this neighborhood, Edward. It's time we lived like the people you build houses for." He remembered that line for years. It had sounded harmless, almost logical. But in hindsight, it marked the moment she stopped saying, "we," and started saying, "you." By 2022, their dinner conversations had become lists of things. She wanted a new car, another renovation, a trip to Europe with her friends. He kept saying yes because he was tired. Because saying no meant explaining why he was gone so often. Because every argument ended with her silence, and silence in their home had become unbearable. When the pandemic hit, Edward found himself working late nights alone in the office, while Helen stayed home watching design shows and scrolling through real estate listings. The laughter that once filled their evenings turned into the hum of distant televisions. One night he returned home early and found her asleep in the guest room. When he asked, she said, "You snore too much." That was the last time he questioned her distance. Looking back now, he realized she hadn't betrayed him. Suddenly, it had been a slow, deliberate erosion, like water wearing down stone. The woman he married had disappeared long before the silver Lexus in the driveway. He just hadn't noticed because he was too busy building houses for other people to live in. He sat in the dim glow of his office lamp, running a thumb across the old photograph of them at their first house. Helen smiling with paint on her cheek, himself young and proud, believing love was something you could reinforce with effort. He whispered into the quiet, "It wasn't the money that ruined us. It was the silence we mistook for peace." The following days passed with the stillness of a house waiting for a storm. Helen moved through the rooms like nothing had changed. Soft footsteps, measured smiles, the same gentle voice that once fooled him. Edward matched her performance, calm and polite, never letting her see the fracture beneath the surface. He woke earlier than usual, brewed his own coffee, and began studying bank statements before sunrise. For decades, he had trusted Helen to manage the household accounts. Now, those records were maps of betrayal. Line by line, he traced her purchases, designer handbags, private lunches, boutique hotels, billed as consulting retreats. There was nothing overtly criminal, only patterns. Patterns always told the truth. On the third morning, he called Mark Jennings, his former accountant. "Mark, I need you to pull every personal transaction from the past 12 months, quietly." Jennings hesitated. "Trouble at home." "Let's call it maintenance," Edward said. "And Mark, no one but you touches this file." By noon, the first report arrived. Buried in dozens of normal expenses was a recurring transfer, 6,000, then 8,000, sometimes 10,000 sent to a joint savings account he didn't recognize. The signature read, Helen Kane and David Sloan. For a long time, Edward just stared at the screen. He wasn't angry. Anger was too easy. What he felt was precision, each emotion cataloged, stored, labeled. Proof was beginning to form. The architect in him appreciated the symmetry of it. That evening, Helen came home with her usual grace, humming softly as she set down her purse. Edward was at the table reviewing project plans. She poured wine, smiled, and asked about his day. "Productive," he said. "Yours exhausting. David's firm is a nightmare right now. He's overworked and Brianna's been worried sick." She paused just long enough to watch his reaction. "You should check on her sometime." Edward nodded, his voice neutral. "Maybe I will." They ate dinner in silence, the clink of silverware louder than their thoughts. Helen laughed at something on her phone, her screen angled slightly away from him. He memorized the gesture. It was the same one she used when lying. After she went upstairs, Edward slipped into his study and replayed the recording from the night by David's house. The voices bled through the small speaker, Helen's whisper, David's smug chuckle. He saved a copy onto a secure drive labeled Project Redwood. Beneath it, he wrote a single note, Phase 2, Surveillance. The next morning, he met with a man named Michael Rodriguez at a quiet diner off Burnside Street. Rodriguez had the unremarkable look of someone paid to be invisible. They ordered coffee, spoke little, and exchanged a single envelope. "She's meeting him every Thursday," Rodriguez said. "Riverside Cafe downtown. 2 hours, sometimes longer. They keep it casual, nothing too obvious." But he slid a photograph across the table. Helen laughing, David leaning close, a hand resting where it shouldn't. Edward stared at the image for several seconds. Then he folded it neatly, tucked it back into the envelope, and said, "Keep watching. I want details. Times, receipts, words." Rodriguez nodded. "Discretion guaranteed." Back at the office, Edward reviewed construction site reports with the same steady calm that had made him successful for decades. But his mind was elsewhere. Every spreadsheet, every column of numbers reminded him that architecture was built on patterns, and patterns once revealed were impossible to unsee. That evening, Helen texted, "Running late, meeting a client for dinner." The message was polite, predictable, almost rehearsed. He replied with a simple, "Be safe." Then he called Rodriguez. "She's heading downtown," the detective confirmed. "Riverside Cafe again." "Stay with them," Edward said. "I want to know when she leaves." He ended the call and sat in silence. The office clock ticked toward midnight before the phone rang again. "Got your proof," Rodriguez said. "Photos, timestamps, audio. You'll want to hear this." The next morning, Rodriguez handed him a flash drive. Edward waited until he was alone before pressing play. Helen's voice filled the room again, this time softer, intimate. "You're the only one who ever understood me, David." "You're my clever man," David laughed. "Just don't get sentimental. We'll be free soon. Think of it as redistributing assets." Edward paused the audio. The words replayed in his head like hammer strikes. He opened his notebook, turned to a fresh page, and began sketching, not buildings this time, but people. Lines connected names. Helen, David, account number 8749, Cafe, Thursday, 8:00 p.m. The network of deceit unfolded like blueprints. When he finished, he closed the book and whispered, "They've been building their case. Now it's my turn." The notebook lay open on his desk, a map of betrayal drawn in careful lines. Outside, the rain returned, tapping lightly against the glass, as if to remind him how time moved, steady, unstoppable. Edward closed the cover and leaned back, feeling the old ache in his shoulders. He had spent his life studying structures, calculating how much pressure a wall could bear before it cracked. Now he was testing that same principle on himself. He spent the next few days in quiet preparation. Every smile, every routine remained unchanged. To Helen, nothing seemed different, but beneath the calm surface, Edward was dismantling the world she thought she controlled. He began rerouting account authorizations, freezing automatic transfers, reviewing property deeds. He made small adjustments, imperceptible to anyone not looking closely, yet each one reclaimed a fragment of his power. At night, he would sit by the window with his notebook open, replaying the recordings until the voices no longer hurt. They became data, not memories, evidence, not emotion. "They've been building their case," he murmured again one night, but they forgot who drafts the foundation. He thought often of Lily during those long evenings. She texted daily, always with warmth. "Love you, Dad." She didn't know what was unfolding between her parents, and he wanted to keep it that way for now. Protecting her meant staying silent, pretending normalcy. The hardest part wasn't anger or betrayal, it was performance. Every morning he had to look into Helen's eyes and pretend he hadn't already heard the sound of her plotting his ruin. One Thursday, he decided to test her. When she came home late, raincoat glistening, he was waiting by the stairs. "How was dinner?" he asked casually. Helen froze for a moment too long. "Dinner with your client. You mentioned a meeting." "Oh yes, fine. Long day." She smiled quickly, brushing past him toward the kitchen. "You ate already, leftovers," he said, following her with quiet steps. "You always did like Riverside Cafe. Their creme brulee is good." Her hand tightened around the edge of the counter. "I haven't been there in years." "Really?" His tone remained even. "Funny, someone mentioned seeing you downtown." Helen turned sharply, eyes narrowing. "Are you checking up on me, Edward?" He smiled faintly, not answering. "Just making conversation." She laughed, but the sound was brittle. "You're becoming paranoid. Maybe you need a break from work." He let her have the last word. He always had. That night, Helen texted longer than usual before bed. Edward stood in the hallway outside her room, watching the faint blue glow of her phone through the door crack. The house was quiet except for the sound of her muffled voice. David, most likely. Her tone was soft, almost tender. Then silence. He turned away before the ache in his chest could surface. The next day, Edward met with Rodriguez again. They sat in the detective's car overlooking the cafe. Through the rain-speckled windshield, Helen and David appeared like actors in a play they'd already rehearsed too many times. Rodriguez handed him another envelope. "More than you asked for. You'll want to listen to this one." In the audio, David spoke first. "He's too predictable. Men like him never see it coming. Just sign the paperwork at the right time and it's done." Helen's voice followed, lighter now, confident. "He'll hand over everything. He always does." Edward closed his eyes. For a long time, he didn't move. Then he whispered, "Not this time." Back home, he stood in the entryway, staring at the reflection of the staircase. He could almost see their past lives there, Helen laughing on the landing, Lily sliding down the banister, Sunday mornings filled with sunlight. The echoes still lingered, but they no longer hurt. They were blueprints of something already demolished. He poured himself a drink, the first in years, and sat at the dining table. Outside, thunder rolled over the city. Helen would be home soon, unaware that her husband had already begun phase 3 in his mind: containment. She had built her deception on charm and confidence. He would build his revenge on patience and precision. Edward picked up his phone and opened the encrypted folder labeled Project Redwood. Dozens of audio clips, financial records, and photos blinked on the screen. He selected all of them and moved them into a new directory titled Evidence Submission Draft, Kane vs. Sloan. He stared at the name for a moment, then nodded once. The builder was ready. The storm had a blueprint. And somewhere deep inside, past the fury and exhaustion, Edward felt something unfamiliar stirring control. Tomorrow, the real work would begin. By the end of that week, Edward Kane had reclaimed control of every account that bore his name. The process was methodical. Phone calls, signed forms, discreet visits to the bank. Decades of discipline had taught him how to move without leaving ripples. By Friday morning, Helen's financial world rested in his hands. She didn't know it yet, but the house of glass she had built was about to crack. He visited the main branch of Cascade National Bank where he had played golf with the president for 15 years. "Tom," he said, sliding a folder across the mahogany table, "I need to place temporary security holds on all joint accounts, identity verification, photo ID, dual confirmation, routine precaution." Tom Bradley adjusted his glasses. "Is something wrong?" "Nothing wrong," Edward replied with calm precision. "Just prudent." Tom nodded. "Understood. We'll notify both parties once it's active." Edward smiled faintly. "That's the point." By noon, the digital locks engaged. Helen's cards would work until the next billing cycle. After that, every transaction would demand his confirmation. The timing was perfect. At 12:37 p.m., while Edward reviewed architectural drafts, his phone buzzed with a notification: declined transaction, Riverside Women's Club, $246.03. 5 minutes later, the second alert came: failed payment, luxury boutique, $420. He leaned back, waiting. At 12:55 p.m., Helen called. "Edward," she said, voice trembling, "something's wrong with the accounts. My card was declined at lunch. They said there's a hold. Did you do something?" He paused just long enough to let her panic breathe. "A hold? That's strange. Must be the bank tightening security again. I'll call Tom and check. It's humiliating, Edward. I was with Linda and Susan. They looked at me like I was some thief." "I'm sure it's a misunderstanding," he said softly. "You know how banks are with fraud these days. Just give it a few hours." She exhaled sharply. "You're too calm about this. Would you rather I panic?" Silence. Then she hung up. Across town, Rodriguez was parked near the club, camera in hand. He recorded Helen storming out, phone pressed to her ear, face tight with fury. She drove straight to David Sloane's office. Rodriguez followed at a distance, noting the timestamp. By 2:14 p.m., Edward received a new message. "They're meeting now. You'll want to hear this." He waited until nightfall to open the file. The audio began with the sound of rain against glass. Then David's voice, measured low, rehearsed. "This isn't a coincidence," David said. "He's protecting assets, probably suspects something." Helen's tone wavered between anger and fear. "He can't just cut me off. After everything I've done for him." "Legally he can," David replied. "Unless we shift the narrative." "What do you mean, we claim financial abuse? That he's controlling, manipulative, using money to isolate you? It's a recognized pattern. Judges eat it up." Edward froze. He could hear the rustle of papers in the background, the sound of a pen clicking. "David, that's dangerous," Helen said, voice trembling. "There's no proof of abuse." "There doesn't need to be," David said calmly. "Only perception. You start documenting incidents, small things. Times he refused to share financial details, raised his voice, questioned your spending, reframed generosity as control." Helen's breathing quickened. "And Lily, she'll believe you. You're her mother. Besides, we can use her background in psychology to reinforce the case, say you've been emotionally manipulated for years." Edward stopped the recording and stared into the darkness of his office. His pulse didn't rise. His hands didn't shake. The fury had burned out days ago. What remained was ice. He rewound the file and listened again, transcribing every word by hand. Then he saved it to his encrypted drive under a new folder. Phase 4. Counteraction. Knuckle beneath it, he wrote a single sentence. "They weaponized empathy. I'll weaponize truth." That night, Helen returned home around 9. She entered quietly, like someone trying not to wake a sleeping conscience. Edward sat in his study lamp, glowing, a glass of untouched bourbon beside him. "How was your day?" he asked without turning. She hesitated. "Tiring. Bank still hasn't fixed the issue. I'll call again tomorrow." "Good idea." He looked up, finally meeting her eyes. "Make sure you tell them everything." Something in his tone made her falter. "Edward, is there something you're not telling me?" "Plenty," he said, "but nothing you'd understand right now." Helen frowned, searching his face for meaning. "You're acting strange lately." He smiled faintly. "So are you." She left the room without another word. When the sound of her footsteps faded, Edward opened his laptop. The cursor blinked like a heartbeat as he began drafting a timeline: dates, accounts, meetings, everything. Truth organized like architecture. At 11:03 p.m., Rodriguez texted again. "They're planning to file by Monday." Edward stared at the message until the screen dimmed. He closed his notebook, exhaled slowly and whispered to the quiet room. They built their plan on lies. I'll build mine on truth. He shut off the lamp, leaving the house in shadow. For the first time in weeks, he felt calm. The war had begun, but the battlefield was his design. Would you stay silent or strike back? The rain had been falling for hours, steady and endless, blurring the city into a watercolor of gold and gray. Edward sat by the window of his office, the same spot where he had once planned towers and bridges. Now, the blueprints on his desk were silent witnesses to something far less tangible, the wreckage of a marriage, a lifetime of misplaced trust. He played the recording again. Helen's laughter drifted through the speakers, faint and hollow, like a ghost trying to remember how to be human. He didn't feel anger this time, only distance. The voice that had once made him believe in forever now sounded like it belonged to a stranger reading a script. He closed his eyes. In the darkness behind them, he could still see her as she once was, the young woman in a red sweater, hair tangled from the wind, smiling at him over a shared cup of cheap coffee. That version of Helen existed somewhere outside of time, untouched by greed or resentment. He wondered if she ever thought of those days, or if memory had been replaced entirely by ambition. The clock on the wall clicked softly. Midnight. He poured a cup of cold coffee, too tired to care, and stared at his reflection in the glass. The man looking back at him wasn't the builder or the betrayed husband. He was something in between, a survivor of his own creation. He thought about silence, how it had crept into their home long before the betrayal. It began as comfort, the quiet between two people who no longer needed words. Then it became habit, then distance, then defense. And by the time he noticed, silence had built walls higher than any structure he'd ever designed. Maybe that was his mistake. He had mistaken peace for love, stability for connection. He had believed that providing everything was the same as giving enough. Edward leaned back and opened the bottom drawer of his desk. Inside were old letters, birthday cards, holiday notes, the fragments of a family that had once been whole. On top was a small envelope addressed in Lily's handwriting. Happy birthday, Dad. The card was from 2 years ago. He unfolded it carefully. You taught me that real strength doesn't shout. It builds quietly, one honest thing at a time. I hope I become half the person you are. The ink had faded slightly, but the words still carried warmth. He smiled, then frowned. He had built skyscrapers and subdivisions, but the only legacy that mattered was sitting in his hands. He remembered Lily as a child, coloring on the floor of his office, her crayons scattered over drafting paper. "Daddy, why does Mommy cry? Sometimes?" She had asked once, her voice soft as rain. He hadn't known what to say then. He still didn't. The guilt came slowly, not sharp but deep, like an ache that had been waiting to be felt. He hadn't been cruel, but he had been absent. Every missed dinner, every late-night meeting had left Helen alone with her thoughts, and David had stepped into that emptiness like a shadow. He exhaled and whispered, "I built the distance, didn't I?" The room gave no answer, only the sound of rain against the glass. He stood and walked through the quiet house. The walls held photographs of moments frozen in time. Family vacations. Lily's graduation, the Christmas when Helen still wore red. Each smile was genuine, at least for a while. The thought didn't comfort him, but it softened something inside. In the living room, the light from the fireplace flickered weakly. Edward sat on the couch and looked at the wedding photo above the mantel. For the first time, he didn't see the betrayal. He saw two people who had truly tried. He saw hope, ignorance, love, all the fragile things that made tragedy possible. He thought of calling Helen, not to accuse or defend, but to understand. Then he shook his head. Some truths needed silence. Others needed time. Instead, he went back to his office and opened his notebook. Under the previous entries, Phase 1, observe. Phase 2, surveillance. Phase 3, containment. Phase 4, counteraction. He wrote a final line, Phase 5, reflection. Beneath it, he added in careful handwriting, forgiveness isn't weakness, it's the blueprint of survival. He closed the notebook and placed it beside the lamp. Outside, dawn was beginning to touch the edges of the horizon, painting the wet streets with faint silver light. The world was still turning, and so would he. If you believe truth always finds its way like this video, and share your thoughts. Edward stayed by the window long after dawn arrived, watching the city stir to life below him. Cars moved like slow rivers of light, people hurrying through puddles with umbrellas, unaware that somewhere above them a man was quietly rebuilding himself. The ache in his chest was still there, but it no longer ruled him. It had become something manageable, an old wound that had learned how to breathe. He thought about how easily trust erodes, how small choices, one skipped dinner, one half-hearted apology can turn into entire years of silence. Love, he realized, doesn't collapse in one day. It weakens at the corners first, like a roof left unattended in the rain. And by the time you notice the water stains, the rot has already begun. He wondered what Helen was feeling now. Panic, maybe, shame, or perhaps nothing at all. There had been a time when he would have wanted her to suffer, to feel the same humiliation she'd planned for him, but that desire had passed. All he wanted now was truth, clean and quiet like a room after the storm. On the desk lay the blueprint of his newest project, a riverside museum designed to reflect light through curved glass. He stared at it for a long time, tracing the lines with his fingertip. Architecture was the art of forgiveness, he thought. Every mistake could be redesigned, every flaw strengthened by a better foundation. Maybe people weren't so different. He picked up the phone and almost dialed Lily's number, then stopped. She deserved to know, but not like this. Not as ammunition in a war between her parents. He would tell her the truth when the dust settled, when it could serve as clarity, not pain. He leaned back, eyes half closed, listening to the rain ease into a soft drizzle. Somewhere downstairs, the old grandfather clock chimed 9 times. The sound reminded him of Sundays long ago. Lily laughing, Helen humming in the kitchen, pancakes burning slightly because he'd distracted them with a story from the worksite. Those moments still existed, frozen in time, untouched by what came later. Maybe forgiveness wasn't forgetting. Maybe it was learning to look at the past without needing to fix it. Edward rose and opened the window. The cool air brushed against his face, carrying the smell of wet cedar and asphalt. He felt strangely light, as if the air itself had lifted some of the weight from his shoulders. The city below glistened, washed clean. He whispered almost to himself, "Every structure needs a second draft." He turned from the window, placed his hand on the notebook, and whispered one more line for himself, and for whoever would hear his story someday. It's never too late to rebuild. Just start with the cracks you tried hardest to hide. The morning came quiet and pale, the kind of stillness that follows a long storm. Edward sat at his kitchen table, hands around a cup of untouched coffee, watching sunlight slide across the floor. The city outside was washed clean. He had expected chaos, confrontation, something dramatic. Instead, there was only calm. The kind that comes when there's nothing left to lose. His phone buzzed. A message from Lily. "Dad, can we talk today? I'm coming to the office." For a moment he didn't move. Then he exhaled slowly and typed back, "Of course." He arrived early, unlocking the glass doors of Kane Builders before the rest of the staff. The air smelled faintly of sawdust and ink, his favorite kind of silence. He poured a fresh pot of coffee, though he doubted he'd drink any of it. On his desk lay the notebook open to the last line he'd written. "It's never too late to rebuild." At 9:15, the elevator chimed. Lily stepped out, her posture straight, her face composed but pale. She looked so much like her mother that it hurt. Yet her eyes held something Helen had long lost: honesty. "Hi, Dad." Her voice trembled slightly. "Hi, sweetheart. Sit down." She placed her purse on the chair beside her, fingers twisting nervously. "Mom says you've been controlling the accounts, that you cut her off without warning." Edward didn't answer right away. Instead, he turned his laptop toward her and pressed play. Helen's voice filled the office, smooth and rehearsed. "We claim financial abuse. He's controlling, manipulative, using money to isolate you. It's a recognized pattern. Judges eat it up." Then David's voice followed, cold and clinical. "You start documenting incidents, times he refused to share financial details. Reframe generosity as control." Lily froze. Her hands covered her mouth as if to keep from crying out. The audio continued, every lie, every calculation laid bare. When it ended, silence filled the room, so thick it felt physical. I didn't want you to hear this, Edward said softly, but you needed to know. Lily stared at him, eyes wide with disbelief. She planned all this with David. He nodded once. For months, maybe longer, tears slid down her face silently. I thought something was off. Mom's been distant, secretive. And David, he started asking questions about your company, about legal ownership structures. I thought he was just curious. He was building a case. She looked down, shaking her head. How could she do this to you? To us? Edward leaned forward, resting his elbows on the desk. People don't change overnight, Lily. They drift, little by little, until one day they're standing somewhere they swore they'd never be. Your mother lost herself trying to be someone else. Lily wiped her cheeks. And you? Did you know before that day at David's house? He smiled faintly. Sad but calm. I knew something was wrong, but I didn't want to believe it. Belief is easier than truth until it costs you everything. She took a long breath, her voice steadier now. I'm sorry, Dad. I should have seen it too. No, he said gently. You shouldn't have to carry any of this. None of it's yours. They sat in silence for a moment, the hum of the city faint through the glass windows. Then Lily reached across the desk and took his hand. I'm leaving, David, she said. I already packed my things last night. I couldn't stay after realizing what he's done. Edward's throat tightened. Lily, you don't have to do that because of me. I'm doing it because of me, she said firmly. Because I can't build a life on deceit. You always said the truth holds better than any lie. He nodded, unable to speak. The words he'd been holding back for months finally slipped through. I'm sorry, too. For being gone so much, for missing things that mattered. I thought I was protecting this family by building something solid, but I was only building walls. Lily smiled through her tears. Then let's tear them down together. He squeezed her hand gently. The sunlight caught in her hair, turning it gold, and for a moment he saw the child she once was, the one who used to run to him with paint-stained hands and questions about the world. Now she sat before him, grown and strong, carrying both their hopes. She stood walking to the window. You know, she said softly, Mom always told me you built things to last. I guess she forgot that includes yourself. Edward joined her by the glass, the city alive beneath them. Sometimes it takes losing everything, he said quietly, to remember what you were building for. They stood side by side in silence, watching the traffic below, two survivors of the same storm. Then Lily turned toward him, her voice barely a whisper. Dad, there's something you should know. He looked at her, sensing the tremor in her tone. What is it, Mom and David? They're not done yet. The light shifted, a shadow passing over the office floor. Edward felt the calm in his chest tighten again. Then, neither am I, he said, his voice steady as stone. The next morning dawned sharp and quiet, the kind of cold that made the air feel like glass. Edward woke before the alarm, his body still tuned to the rhythm of discipline. The storm outside had passed, but inside something darker lingered, a strange calm, like the silence before demolition. He brewed coffee, opened his email, and found it waiting. The subject line read, Petition for restraining order and immediate spousal support. The sender was Helen's attorney. He clicked without hesitation. The document loaded slowly, page after page of legal accusations written in language as sterile as betrayal. Financial abuse, emotional intimidation, pattern of control. He read every word without blinking. When he finished, he leaned back in his chair, took a sip of coffee, and whispered, So this is how she wants to end it. Within the hour, he was sitting across from James Morrison, his oldest friend and attorney. Morrison skimmed the documents, then raised an eyebrow. She's accusing you of manipulation, Edward. That's bold considering what we have. Edward slid a flash drive across the desk. Everything's here. Dates, recordings, transfers, the cafe meetings, all of it. Morrison smiled grimly. Then we let the truth speak. The courtroom smelled faintly of rain and dust. Helen sat at the plaintiff's table in a dark blazer, her hair tied back, eyes rimmed with tears that might have been rehearsed. Across from her, Edward sat motionless, hands folded, expression unreadable. Lily was there too, seated quietly behind him, her gaze fixed on the floor. The judge entered, papers shuffling. Helen's attorney rose, her voice soft, sympathetic, dripping with feigned sincerity. Your Honor, my client has endured months of isolation and financial cruelty. Her husband has systematically restricted her access to funds, creating emotional distress. Morrison interrupted politely, Your Honor. Before we proceed, the defense would like to submit audio evidence relevant to the plaintiff's claims. The judge nodded. Proceed. Morrison pressed play. The courtroom filled with Helen's voice. We claim financial abuse. He's controlling, manipulative, using money to isolate you. Judges, eat it up. Then, David's voice followed, smug, confident. Reframe generosity as control. Helen's face drained of color. The words echoed through the courtroom, each one carving away another layer of her performance. Murmurs rippled through the spectators. Her attorney fumbled for a response, but the recording continued, undeniable and complete. When the audio ended, the silence was absolute. The judge looked over his glasses. Mrs. Kane, do you wish to respond to this evidence? Helen opened her mouth, but no words came. David, seated 2 rows back, had gone pale. His phone buzzed with incoming messages from a number he didn't recognize, likely the Bar Association. Within hours, he'd learned that an investigation into his firm had already begun. Morrison closed the laptop gently. Your Honor, the defense rests. The gavel struck once. Petition denied. Outside, the rain had started again, thin and steady. Helen stood under the courthouse awning, staring at the wet pavement, mascara streaking down her face. Edward walked past her without stopping. She reached for him once, maybe to speak, maybe to beg, but he didn't turn around. Some things couldn't be fixed with words. Lily caught up to him on the steps. You okay? He nodded. Truth doesn't need victory. It just needs air. They walked together in silence until the sound of rain swallowed the world. 6 months later, the house felt different, quieter, but honest. Edward spent his mornings sketching, his afternoons walking along the river. Lily visited on weekends, helping him sort old files and draft new designs for a charity housing project. Life like concrete was setting again, stronger this time. One evening, as twilight settled over the city, the mail arrived. Among the bills and catalogs was an unmarked envelope, no return address. Inside, a single sheet of paper with 4 handwritten words. You think it's over. Edward stared at it for a long moment, then folded it neatly and set it on the desk beside his coffee mug. He looked out the window where the last traces of daylight lingered and said quietly, Maybe not. But I am. He turned off the lamp. The room slipped into shadow, filled only by the hum of the rain and the whisper of memory. Voices fade, but guilt echoes louder. If this story moved you, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support helps us keep telling these echoes of betrayal. Thank you for watching.